Can we? Okay, possiamo, bene. Ok. Allora, buonasera a tutti, but I will change into English because the lecture tonight is in English. And I'm also pleased to see that we have not just the participant of the summer school, which is the occasion for this lecture, but also some guests here. So thank you very much for coming. And just before I introduce our speaker tonight, just to give you a framework, and because Professor Alain Delattre is actually supposed to be our keynote speaker, something like a keynote speaker, in the framework of the 7th International Summer School for Coptic Papyrology. I would have changed this a little bit, the title, which we had here for the last week. So today was the last day. So I say this actually for the people probably watching maybe online on Facebook or later on YouTube. And yes, so this is the occasion, and we decided to make this lecture public because Professor Delattre is giving not a very specific, he has a specific topic, but it's a wider topic which will interest a wider audience. So to introduce Alain Delattre, he has been professor of Greek, on Coptic language and literature and papyrology at the University or Université Libre de Brussels since 2013, so first assistant professor and later full professor. But since 2014, he has also been director of studies at the École pratique des hautes études in Paris. And also here is a focus on the Coptic language and documentary objects or sources. After studying classical philology and Oriental languages and literature at the university in Brussels, he wrote his thesis on a lot of Greek and Coptic papyri from the Bayeux monastery, preserved also today in Brussels. And also during the summer school, we had some references to those. He was then a postdoctoral fellow again, first at the University of Brussels, but he left also Brussels because he was also a postdoctoral fellow at the University in Leuven. And thanks to a Marie Curie fellowship, he did a postdoctoral research for 3 years at the University in Leiden. His research focused mainly on Coptic and Greek papyrology, monasticism in late antiquity and the 1st century of Islam, and the epigraphic of Christian Egypt. He has written, I will not count this, but more than 2 monographs, edited 6 collected works, and published around 100 articles in scientific journals and conference proceedings around this topic. And furthermore, he was involved in nearly all the preceding summer schools, and this is why he is, I think, the optimal, finest speaker for our Coptic summer school. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much for inviting me to give this conference at the end of the 7th International Summer School in Coptic Papyrology, which began on Monday and has brought together students and teachers from all over the world for an intense week of teaching and work on papyri. And what better place than the Museo Egizio in Turin to organize such a summer school and to attempt, as I'm going to do, to retrace a few elements of the history of Coptic papyrology, since, as I will show, the museum played a role in the birth of Coptic papyrology. In this talk, I will attempt to paint a portrait of a discipline, Coptic papyrology, by presenting a number of important scholars and some Coptic documents that may illustrate this field of research. The choice of examples will be largely subjective. With such a wealth of documentation, it was necessary to make a choice, and I have tried to give some priority to the antiquities kept in the Museo Egizio. I will include in my presentation at each stage a few more methodological remarks relating to the present and future challenges of Coptic papyrology. 1788 is the traditional birth date of papyrology. It is the year in which the first Greek documentary papyrus, the Carta Borgiana, was published by the Danish scholar Niels Shaw. This papyrus is a 2nd century tax document from Teptunis in the Fayum, but above all, and it was its interest, it is an authentic document, coming directly from antiquity without the intermediary of medieval copies. Since the publication of the Carta Borgiana, over 60,000 Greek papyri and ostraca have been published, providing us with first-hand information on the history of Greco-Roman Egypt. Unlike literary texts, which have been selected and distorted over the centuries as copies have been made of them, or even unlike epigraphic texts, which often emanate from the elites and seek to use the publicity offered by Stone to deliver a message to their contemporaries or even to future generations. Papyri, on the other hand, have been preserved by chance, simply because of Egypt's exceptional hot and dry climate. They were not intended to survive, they were not intended to be preserved and read by us. And thanks to this, they give us a wealth of information that has disappeared elsewhere for the antiquity. Of course, papyrologists must always question the validity of the information they find in the papyri. To what extent do they restitute facts, data, that can be generalized to the whole Mediterranean basin? And to what extent do they bear witness to specific features peculiar to Egypt? This is a fundamental question for papyrologists. And finally, we should add that while these documents were indeed preserved by chance in Egypt, they do not represent the whole Egypt. The climate of the delta is too humid for papyri to be preserved, for example. And we should not forget that they necessarily come from a wealthy environment that had access to writing. Small transactions and the lives of humble people leave little or no written trace. Be that as it may, thanks to these documents, we have been able to understand the whole story, the institutions of Ptolemaic, Roman, Byzantine, and early Islamic Egypt, to reconstruct the economy of the Egypt and hence of the Roman Empire, and finally to discover the daily life of the inhabitants from the conquest of Alexander the Great until about a century after the Arab conquest. In other words, during what papyrologists call the papyrological millennium. Very well, but 1788 is the date on which the first Greek papyrus was published. The papyrological millennium refers to Greek documents, because we have Egyptian papyri before and after the above-mentioned dates. This very Hellenocentric presentation of papyrology can be explained by the primacy of the study of Greek documents over those written in other languages, and also by the energy of the Hellenist papyrologists who created the discipline and developed the tools that enabled it to grow. Coptic papyrology, as well as Demotic and Arabic papyrology, are ultimately the offspring of Greek papyrology. There is no official date of birth for Coptic papyrology, so I suggest that we consider, as we do for Greek, the date of publication of the first papyrological document, so not a literary text but a document. In this case, it is an ostracon. The date is 1850, more than 60 years after the Carta Borgiana. Of course, Coptic documents were mentioned before, but to my knowledge, this is the first real edition with a translation and commentary. This text was published by the German Egyptologist Gustav Seyffart, who is known because he was convinced that he had found the key to interpreting the hieroglyph, even if he was the only one to think so. In an article published in the fourth issue of the Zeitschrift der Deutschen Morgenländischen Gesellschaft, he published a Coptic ostracon found in what was then the Regio Museo di Antichità ed Egizio. In other words, the first Coptic papyrological text is preserved here in the museum, the Museo Egizio. Unfortunately, it was not an easy text, and in fact, no papyrological text is easy, as the students of the summer school know now. And unfortunately for Seyffart, he didn't really understand what it was all about. Let's have a look. The first line is generally well read, apart from the first word, where he thought it was a reading variant of the word which means bones, whereas it is an imperative, give it, that means give the letter to someone. In the second line, you have to read the rare name Franguet, it's a name. I will come back to the name and the personage at the end of my talk. Next, the name Azarias should be read, and he is the son, in the spiritual sense, of Franguet. The rest, unfortunately for Seyffart, is written using a cryptographic system of permuted letters with which he was unfamiliar. The Turin text should therefore be understood in this way. Give the letter, to my father Franguet from Azarias his son, Moses, Sabinos, Abraham. Admittedly, this first edition was not very conclusive, but during the second half of the 19th century, more and more studies were carried out, and they gradually became more scientifically sound. Let's stay in Turin for a moment and present a well-known text. This ostracon from the Theban region that you can see on the screen was first published by Ludwig Stern in 1878 and then by Francesco Rossi in 1895. This very short document relates a solar eclipse. On the 14th day of the month Faminot, in the 14th year in the indiction, the sun darkened at the 4th hour of the day. The 4th of Famenot corresponds to the 10th of March, and it was only in 2006 that astronomer Gilmore and Orientalist Ray were able to show definitively that the only possible total eclipse in the Theban region on March 10 was the one that took place in the year 601 at around 10 a.m., which effectively corresponds to the 4th hour of the day. But the study of the text doesn't stop there. A few years later, Chantal showed that, in all probability, the ostracon was written in the hand of the priest Mark, a highly erudite figure from this region, who also left us a large number of documents. As you can see from the editio princeps to the present day, the study of Coptic papyri and ostraca is the fruit of a collective effort. And it is always necessary to go back to the text published in the past, to correct them, to reinterpret them in the light of the new information available, which often allows us to better understand the context in which they were produced and thus to reconstruct history. Coptic papyrology developed throughout the 19th century, but was still in its infancy. A qualitative and quantitative step forward was taken in the first half of the 20th century by Walter Ewing Crum. This British scholar brought Coptic papyrology and Coptic studies in general into the modern scientific world. His opus magnum is the Coptic dictionary to which he devoted his life and which is still the reference tool used today. To make his dictionary, Crum published unpublished text tirelessly over many years. There are now just over 10,000 Coptic papyri and ostraca published, but Crum alone has published almost 4,500 texts. As you can imagine, it is impossible to choose a single emblematic text given the number of documents he has published. It is perhaps his editions of papyri from the Theban region, from Jeme, the Coptic village set up in the ruins of the temple of Ramses III at Medinet Abu, that are the richest. I'm thinking here of the corpus entitled Die Koptischen Reichsurkunden aus Theben, a collection of 120 papyri, often large in size, published or republished by Walter Crum and Georg Steindorf in 1912. The absence of translations and commentaries explains why this extraordinary corpus was little studied in the end. We have there contracts for the sale of land or house, such as this text preserved in Turin, displayed in room 13, I just checked, and which is over 1 meter long. You see here a close-up of the signatures of the witnesses and the subscription of the scribe, Jeremias, son of Athanasius, who is badly known, but who wrote another document still unpublished, preserved in Brussels. The most extraordinary documents in this corpus are undoubtedly the 26 child donations. That is, contracts by which the inhabitants of the town or other nearby villages gave their children as servants to the monastery of Foibamon, set up in the ruins of Hatshepsut's temples at Derelbari. These documents have been the subject of numerous studies. You can see on the screen references to recent studies by Arieta Papakonstaniou and Sebastian Richter. And this process of child donation was interpreted in a variety of ways. Sometimes in a very negative way. The donation of children is said to be made by families in precarious situations who have no choice but to separate themselves from their children. Sometimes in a positive way, close to the system of the oblatio puerorum in the West, in which high-ranking families give their child to the monastery so that he can get a good education and become a monk once grown up. Whatever the historical and sociological reality of this practice, the documents include a particularly interesting narrative section which serves to motivate and explain the donation and to place it within a religious framework. The text evokes the story of Anna and Samuel in the Old Testament. Anna, despairing of not being a mother, prays to God to give her a child whom she vows to consecrate to him. The child was born, the prophet Samuel, who indeed dedicated his life of God. You have on the screen the translation of the narrative part of a contract drawn up in 775 by Foibamon, who gives his son to the monastery. After the mercy God has ordered and my son was born, I thought of my sins and decided that if he would live, I would give him to the monastery of Apa Foibamon for the salvation of my soul. But when the little boy grew up and made good progress, I intended to break my vow, and I settled with God and his saint. After that, the little boy fell into a great and very severe disease, and we had much grief about the little boy, and we were envious to see all the healthy little children who are the consolation of their parents. We discussed, I and his mother, that perhaps God and his saint had done this for us, since we have infringed the alliance that we had formed with him. We consulted together, let's set off and take the little boy and go to the holy monastery and request the holy martyr, forgive us the boldness we have done. Perhaps he will ask God and he gives healing to the little boy. Then we took the little boy and brought him into the holy monastery. We always besought God and his saint, the holy Foibamon. We cried and besought the martyr, forgive us the sin we have done. And we always received the Holy Communion together with the little boy. And after a period of 1 month, he who had listened to the prayer of the blessed Anna, the mother of Samuel the prophet, also listened to us. He gave healing to the little boy, and we went back home, praised God, and reflected. This little boy was counted among the dead before he received healing, but now he has got well, so he may become a servant of the holy monastery, the place where he received healing. This narrative dresses up the experience, giving it an acceptable moral meaning whatever the conditions that prevailed, which probably lie at the intersection of economic, religious, and social consideration. Little present at scientific congresses and events, Crum had no real disciples in the academic world. Various leading figures subsequently illustrated Coptic Papyrology. For example, the scholar Paul Kahl Jr., who produced who produced an exemplary publication of the documentation from the monastery of Deir el-Baha'isa, including a fundamental study of the Coptic language and its dialectal variation. Or Walter Thiel, who published numerous texts from the very rich collection of the Vienna Papyrussammlung, as well as various studies on legal documents and numerous translations, notably of PKRU. I would like to mention one last scholar of Coptic Papyrology, much closer to us in time, and whose influence has been, I believe, considerable on Coptic studies and on our present day. I'm referring to Sarah Clarkson, who tragically died at the age of 38. Her contribution to papyrology was twofold. Firstly, she put a strong and definitive end to the separation, even segregation, between Greek and Coptic papyrology. The title of her book, Coptic and Greek Texts Relating to the Hermopolite Monastery of Apollo, published in 2000, makes this clear. This is the first edition of Coptic text in which the choice was made to include also Greek texts and to make this clear in the title. And yes, it is important to study a text written in both languages, as they represent two facets of the same society. This is a fundamental approach for the historian. You cannot walk with one eye open to Greek and the other one closed to Coptic, or vice versa. The monastery of Apollo, referred to in the title of her book, is a large monastery in Middle Egypt located near the village of Bawit. This establishment is known from a number of sources, both literary, since the life of the founder Apollo has been the subject of several stories, and archaeological, since the site, which covers more than 40,000 square meters, was excavated at the beginning of the 20th century and is still excavated today. As a result, we have a considerable amount of information drawn from a number of different sources, which we can and must compare. In addition to literary, archaeological, and epigraphic sources, more than 1,300 inscriptions have been published to date. There are papyri and ostraca, found in large numbers, mainly during illegal excavations since the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, and then sold on the antiquities market and dispersed in dozens of collections around the world. There is hardly a collection, large or small, that does not possess texts from Bawit. And this is where Sarah Clarkson's contribution has been decisive. She made a meticulous study of certain types of Coptic documents and carried out museum archaeology. That is, she tried to find out when and through whom the papyri she was studying had entered the collections. Some of these documents were definitely from the Bawit monastery, and she was able to show that the other similar documents therefore came from the same monastery, as well as, in all probability, the other documents that had been acquired at the same time. She was thus able to virtually reconstitute the archives of the Bawit monastery, which now contain almost 1,000 papyrological texts that provide, of course, us with invaluable information about the life of this great Egyptian monastery. Sarah Clarkson's study has been fundamental and has enabled all the researchers who have followed in her footsteps to make considerable progress. Establishing the provenance of a text means restoring its context and enabling historians to make use of them. In the case of the Bawit monastery, the context, as I've said, is particularly rich, and there are many connections between the sources. To illustrate this, I will start with what is often considered to be one of the masterpieces of Coptic art, the icon of Christ and Abbot Mena in the Louvre. As old photo taken during the excavation show, this icon came from the Bawit monastery. It was stolen during the excavation and subsequently purchased by a French collector who donated to the Louvre in 1918. The icon depicts two figures standing in strict frontal position. Remains of vegetation can be discerned at their feet. Hills and a sunset sky form the background. On the right is Christ, a Coptic inscription specifying his identity as Psoter, the Savior. He is slightly taller than the figure on the left. Christ has a light beard and his eyes are wide open. In his left hand, he holds a book richly decorated with pearls and precious stones and with metal clasp visible on the side. As a sign of protection, his right hand is placed on the left shoulder of Mena, who is wearing a graying beard. With his right hand, Mena makes a gesture of blessing. The inscription states that Mena was the superior, the proestos in Greek, of the monastery, to give the figures a strong presence. And finally, the intimacy of Christ's gesture gives a feeling of humanity that is quite exceptional, far removed from Byzantine art. 25 years ago, art historian Marie-Hélène Rujovskaya have identified this Mena of the icon with another figure painted on a wall in the monastery of Bawit. The two figures bear a strong resemblance. The one in the icon appears older, but is the superior of the monastery, whereas in the wall painting he bears the title of Papa, which means he is a priest, and holds keys in his hand, which probably indicates that he is an oikonomos, so the monk specialized in the economic activities. Let's now look for Mena in epigraphic and papyrological documentation. First of all, let's look at the information provided by the monastery's official inscriptions. I mean the about 30 wooden lintels placed above the doors when a building was constructed. These lintels are therefore part of the official program of the monastery and often mention the people who were in charge during the construction of the building. The lintels mention two mena. If you look at the first two from Rome and Cairo, you can see that there is a trio of people in charge at the highest level of the monastery, a general superior, Appa Isaac, and two subordinates, Mena and Athanasius, whose titles change. In the Cairo lintel, Mena is deuterarius, that is the second in command, the right-hand man of the superior Isaac, while Athanasius is an archivist. In the Rome lintel, Mena has risen in rank. He has become superior, probably superior of the monastery of Bawit, while Isaac is the superior of the whole monastic congregation that included Bawit and other monasteries. And also in the Rome lintel, Athanasius has become deuterarius, replacing Mena. Finally, the London lintel show an oikonomos with the title Papa Mena. It is difficult not to make the connection between the two Mena on the lintels and the icon of Christ and the painting on the wall. Let's now look at what papyri can tell us. Let's start with a papyrus from Michigan. This is a letter written by a superior of the monastery of Bawit to a certain Papa Mena oikonomos. It is well possible that this is our Mena attested in the London lintel and in the painting of the monastery. Although, of course, there may have been several oikonomos and priests named Mena in the history of the monastery. Let's now look at another papyrus, which was discovered during the 2007 excavation campaign at the Bawit Monastery. It is a contract for a plot of land involving a large sum of money. We have the end of the contract at the top, at the very bottom, the signatures of the witnesses who validated the deed, and between these two parties, two signatures. Given the nature of the contracts, the superior had to sign, because the transaction is financially very important. But here we have two people signing. The first is a certain Isaac, and the second, a Mena. The combination of these two names, known in the lintels of Rome and Cairo as having held high offices within the monastery, makes the identification very plausible. So at the end of the investigation, we seem to have an exceptional dossier which shows us the monk Mena first as oikonomos, then as deuterarius, and then as proestos of the great monastery of Bawit, with epigraphic and papyrological documents showing him in his various roles. There are also two figurative representations of him, one dating from one of his first position, that of Oikonomos, and the second from what was probably his last position, that of Proestos of the monastery. And the icing on the cake is that we even have Mena's autograph. So you can see how interesting could be this kind of research, taking into account archaeological, epigraphic, and papyrological sources. The last point I'm going to address is another recent discovery. And once again, I'm going to focus on a personality. And once again, a monk, sorry. Geza Schenker rightly pointed out at the last Congress of Coptic Studies that our vision is somewhat Monaco-centric, I confess, but this is also due to our documentation. So the last person I'm going to talk about is a monk from the first half of the 8th century, whose dwelling and archives has been discovered in the Theban mountain. It is the monk Franguet, the same one who was the recipient of the Turin text I showed you at the beginning of my talk. In the early 2000s, excavations by the Université Libre de Bruxelles in Theban tomb 29, TT 29, the tomb of Amenemope, vizier of Pharaoh Amenhotep II in the 18th dynasty, brought to light Coptic remains of great importance, which reveal the reoccupation of the court and the tomb by Christian monks. Hundreds of Coptic ostraca were discovered on this occasion, which make it possible to identify two different occupations, one from the 7th century and the other, richer and more extensive, from the first half of the 8th century. The occupant of the site at the later time was a monk named Franguet, who lived there for several years with his disciple Moses. Franguet worked as a weaver, as a copyist, and as a book binder, as the archaeological remains and texts have shown. Here on the screen, you can see the pit of his loom, a book binding plate he has made, and his inkwell with his calamus still stuck in it. Franguet has left us a documentation that is exceptional in its scope and quality. As a matter of fact, he was an intellectual and a professional writer with a good knowledge of literary texts, especially the Bible. Hundreds of his letters have been preserved, which he kept in his cell. Obviously concerned with his written work, he kept copies of his messages, or more likely, he asked his correspondents to bring back the letters he sent, perhaps in order to check that his requests had been fulfilled, or even for archiving purposes. In addition to the letters written by himself, there are also, to a lesser extent, the letters he received. Perhaps most of his correspondents answered him orally, while he, as a monk, rarely traveled. A few dozen letters written by him or addressed to him and found in various places in the vicinity complete the corpus of his correspondence, and it is the case, for example, of the Turin ostraca. In all, we now have nearly 100 letters addressed to Franguet and more than 400 letters written by him. Nearly all these texts were published by Anne Boudor and Chantal Hurtel in 2010, Such a collection, which includes so many letters written by a single individual, is quite exceptional and constitutes a rich source of information, particularly valuable for the study of ancient epistolography. Franguet was indeed a scholar who knew and mastered the epistolary codes to perfection, including the formal aspect, and who did not hesitate to play on them. The corpus thus contains a very wide range of letters which express the entire spectrum of feelings, from exalted admiration to the coldest anger. Let's see an example. In Franguet 162, Franguet addresses Azarias, against whom he is particularly irritated. In keeping with his habit of covering the whole surface of the chart, he has added something in the upper margin. Usually, he adds some religious formula, like Jesus Christ, something like that. The difference here is that this is not a religious formula, but a reproachful interpellation. Disobedient Azarias. Let's read the text. So, disobedient Azarias. The Lord said to his disciples, "He who listens to you listens to me. Now, if I send for you repeatedly and you do not obey me once, nor come to me to meet me for my business, what is the use of your coming to me at all? If it is not enough for me to ask you once for you to obey me and come to me for my business, you need not come to me at all. You have succeeded in coming this time. Go to Moses, you do not obey, neither will you find with us too." The entire letter is designed to impress Azarias. Apart from the title, Disobedient Azarias, added in the margin, which seeks to make Azarias feel guilty, there are several devices intended to punish him. The letter does not contain any form of politeness, and Franguet does not name himself. Azarias does not even deserve Franguet's name. The text begins abruptly with a biblical quotation, Luke 10:16, in which Franguet compares his authority over Azarias to that of Jesus over his disciples. He then threatens to cut off Azariah if he does not obey him immediately. We will not find peace with Franguet and his disciple Moses, and there is no need to come to him anymore. The language at the end of the letter, as the editors note, is particularly incisive thanks to the use of parataxis. A final formal device is used in the letter. Franguet has written in a larger module the words tutte, terrà, what is the use, and this usage probably corresponds more or less to the modern practice of writing in capital letters the words one would shout if faced with one's interlocutor. The exceptional nature of the dossier in terms of its size and the strong character of its author gives us a glimpse of what is not usually seen in documentation: rudeness, power struggles, and threats. The impoliteness of Franguet appears both as a marker of discontent and as a separate strategy to destabilize the correspondent and make them feel uncomfortable. The absence of polite formulas, the anonymity of certain letters, or graphic and layout procedures are often used by Franguet in addition to the contents and strategies of guild threats or recourse to scriptural authority. In 1850, an ostraca preserved in the Museo Egizio in Turin was published, addressed to Franguet by Azarias. 150 years later, an angry letter from Franguet to Azarias was discovered. We'll probably never know if it is the same Azarias in the two texts. The name is not uncommon. But no matter, our knowledge has grown extraordinarily, and we can measure how far we have come. As I said, to the present day, around 10,000 documents have been published. Every year, around 100 new documents are published. And publishing new text is essential to renew and stimulate our thinking. In addition, much of the material that has already been published needs to be taken up again, translated and commented on in order to extract its substance. Finally, alongside the editorial work, we also need to develop historical, linguistic, and economic studies, which are essential if we want Coptic papyri taken into account beyond the circle of Coptic papyrologists. I chose during this presentation not to talk about the IT tools, and to tell the truth, I didn't think about them until afterwards, because our entire world has now moved into the digital age. Coptic papyrology has jumped on the bandwagon and is gradually catching up. Technical progress is still to come, and I'm thinking, for example, of the relatively recent analysis of inks. By all means, our goal must always be to better understand and interpret these testimonies to the past, these fragments of life and history miraculously preserved in Egypt's hot and dry climate. I have discussed a few documents and a few personalities. The choice is, of course, subjective. Gustave Seyffart as a precursor, somewhat anecdotal. Crum as a sacred monster and pillar of Coptic studies. Sarah Clarkson as a personality who gave a new impetus to Coptic papyrology by breaking down barriers and placing it in a wider and richer context. I've only included scholars who have passed away so as not to make anyone jealous, but there is a whole generation of researchers in the room who represent the present and the future of Coptic papyrology. Coptic papyrology awaits you and awaits us. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this perfect lecture, which was a perfect end, I think, for our summer school, and it was summarizing in so many ways several arguments which were addressed, and of course the final words were, I mean, your final words were very present in the way. So yeah, again, thank you very much. We still have some time for questions or comments, if there are any, from your side.
Well, thank you very much, Alain, for this wonderful lecture. On the icon of the Christ with Abbot Mena, so the Christ holds a book, and Mena, is he holding a roll or something like that? Can you? What do you think of the significance of this roll?
Yes, so indeed Mena is holding a roll in his hand, and it was interpreted as maybe the roll on which the monastic rule of the monastery was written. But I don't know.
Okay, I'm just reminded of paintings of angels, like Gabriel. He is shown carrying a roll because he is the falsche Nufe, the carrier of the good news. And of course, it was an anachronism because the roll was no longer current technology. But I think precisely because it comes from an older age, it implies some prestige. Yeah.
Yes, so I'm not convinced it's the monastic rule, but maybe the inspiration of the prophets, the representation of the prophets. Ezekiel, for example, with a roll, played a role. So kind of parallelism between a high figure in the Old Testament and the superior.
Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful presentation as usual. From your point of view, what are the challenges and opportunities of the Coptic Papyrology in the future?
I think one of the challenges is to continue such summer school, such meeting that can in which papyrologists en herbe in French, so young papyrologists, senior papyrologists can meet, can exchange, and since 20 years there have been a really step forward in Coptic papyrology, and it is because we are now more than we were before. During the second half of the 20th century, Coptic papyrology, it was only Leslie McCall. Then came Sarah Clarkson and Anne Boudor, and Sebastian, and more people are now involved in Coptic papyrology, and the challenge is to continue that. We need Coptic papyrologists.
To return from the programmatic issues to the scientific issues that you mentioned in your paper, I have often seen these wooden lintels with inscriptions, and one usually thinks that they are from Bawit, wherever they are. But I've never grasped this thought that you pronounced today, that these belong to a official decoration program of the monastery. Could you elaborate a bit on this interesting perspective?
Yeah. In fact, at least in the monastery of Bawit, it's full of inscriptions on the wall, etc. These are painted inscriptions written at a later stage. The inscriptions on the lintels are really part of the program, and they always have two elements. The most important one, it is a blessing. a blessing and an invocation to Appa Apollo, the founder of the monastery, and to God also. Sometimes with other saints associated with Apollo, Phoebe and Anub. And in 2/3 of the lintels, we have also a few personages, a few highly ranking officials, usually superiors. In Coptic, usually Piot and Potopos, and other highly ranking officials. In some cases, we have also monks who are just monks. And we have a monk which is oil dealer, and his name is written on a wooden lintel, and I think in this case it is a kind of evergetism. He paid for the building because some monks were very rich, and I think it could be the explanation why we have only monks.
There's actually an online question.
Yes.
Thank you for this lecture. I would ask, just a curiosity, is it possible to find any connection with the style of the I will let you know. Scusami. I can't pronounce it.
Apophthegmata?
Thank you. Exactly. So if there is any connection with the style of the of the Desert Fathers in any ancient narrative before Coptics?
Okay, so...
So it's not just me, okay, yeah.
I'm not sure I understand well the question. Yes, in some way, yes. The apophthegmata patrum were well known for the Coptic monks at a later period, and it was a source of inspiration for them, exactly as Chenute, for example, was a source of inspiration for Franguet and for other monks. So, of course, all these texts from the beginning of monasticism were known later, were imitated in some way. So definitely yes.
So, I mean, online there are no other questions, and if there are no other questions or comments here, I would say, in the name of all, thank you very much again. I mean, we will all meet again now. And thank you very much for the visitors coming to the lecture. Allora, buona serata e ci vediamo per la prossima conferenza.
That's it.